there are mandates that they must follow, and the mandate is that mining activities cannot be allowed on this area. The threat is too much. The Heritage Association of South Africa has placed it at a grade 2 provincial heritage status, and they say that it is of international importance due to the fossil beds that are found there. The area has also been classified by SANBI as a freshwater ecosystem protection area, and that it contains critically endangered wetland systems, which is fed by the Elandsfontein aquifer.
You could end up with a system where you will have salinity increases, where you will have some of your Meyer macrofauna, that's little hochhaitjies, that's dying off, which in the end will have an effect on all these endangered bird species that's coming in from as far as Russia, come and eat here and stay 6 months of the year in the lagoon system. So you can have a detrimental effect if you start polluting or over-abstracting the groundwater system.
This is about not only the needs of present generations, but also of future generations. So if one were to look at, for example, a proposed phosphate mining on the west coast and ask, is this consistent with sustainable development? One of the things one would do is say, let's look at it from the perspective of future generations, the generations that would be living in that area after the mining has ceased. And if one looks at it from that perspective, it's very clear that they would suffer substantial prejudice in the sense that the environment that they would be living in would be substantially degraded relative to the pre-mining environment.
The phosphate mine will threaten the biodiversity, the heritage, and the water of this area. It's going to have huge impacts on it. And I always say to people ask, but what is the fuss about? And I always say to them, we don't even notice it because it's functioning so perfectly. It just happens. We just breathe in fresh air. We just have almost fresh water because the system is functioning properly.
Everybody and anybody that's living within Langebaan is more or less, dependent on tourism. It's either directly or indirectly. You've got your guest houses, you've got your restaurants, which are directly dependent on tourism, and obviously your secondary industries that's supportive of the primary industries. If there's no feed here, if there's no people here being supported by tourism, those industries and secondary industries would not be able to sustain itself.
In terms of who benefits, it's a small group of people who are benefiting, many of them who may not even be South Africans, and normally none of them live in the area, and that the benefit accrues to the small group, and on the other hand the costs are borne by society at large, and particularly by the people who live in the area, and those costs persist over a very long period of time.
It's not what could come here, it's what should come here. We've got limited space here, we've got limited resources here. Stuff that can happen anywhere elsewhere should not come here. We have a competitive edge, we should have that. That would make it economically sustainable, because then we've got the competitive edge. And also in terms of environmentally sustainable, this will depend on civil society to guard what is ours.
Even if we are to transition away from mining, to reduce mining to a minimum, we will be dependent on mining to a significant degree for the foreseeable future. That means that we must undertake mining in a way which minimizes harm to the environment, and that legislative techniques for doing that are the requirements that mines must produce environmental management plans which must guide the operation of the mines, and they must set aside money to rehabilitate the sites afterwards. Now, of course, complete rehabilitation is normally impossible, but certainly rehabilitation makes a big difference if you attempt to cover over the holes and landscape it, etc., and replant it. The landscape ends up looking a lot better than if you simply leave the open mining pits, which are ongoing sources of danger and pollution.
No one's suggesting that mining can never take place in sensitive environments or near game reserves. Clearly in a developing economy like ours, there has to be give and take.
it would be quite difficult for a competent authority to refuse an to refuse a mining permit or mining right application on the basis that the operations cause unacceptable environmental damage, etc., unless that competent authority has pretty strong evidence that that is the case. That could be provided in an environmental impact assessment report and should be provided in such a report. The reality, unfortunately, is that mining companies and mining applicants tend to engage environmental impact assessors who they know will write sweetheart reports for them, which basically justify the mining and play down the negative environmental and socio-economic impacts. And for that reason, the information before the decision maker is normally biased in favor of mining, and it becomes very difficult for the competent decision maker to turn down these applications.
Residents associations, conservation organizations, even other government departments. I mean, we see lots of mining and prospecting right applications where other government departments have submitted comments to the Department of Mineral Resources saying, look, this just can't happen here, guys. There's a disaster. There's either some heritage situation or a biodiversity situation or some kind of tourism or social issue that's going to cause a problem, and it's just completely disregarded by the DMR.
It's generally very unwise in any regulatory system to place a body that is charged with promoting mining or any such activity in charge of regulating the negative impacts of it, because essentially what tends to happen is that they are hamstrung as far as actually stopping harmful activities, and they limit themselves to making slight recommendations regarding conditions and, as it were, tweaking the edges of the performance of a mine. So unfortunately, we are likely to see a situation where the environmental management plans and programs for mines are not going to be nearly as good as they ought to be, and probably they will not be as strictly enforced as they ought to be, certainly without public scrutiny. That has been our experience in many cases in the past.
Requests, pleas, begging from civil society and the conservation sector, even in organizations like the MTPA, just do it, just declare some of these areas no-go zones. Because what happens now is that even if this community fights this mine for years and years and years and eventually wins, which is unlikely, all that will happen is someone else will come along and start the process all over again.
Everything will suffer if the lagoon dies. Our sense of place will suffer. Our get out into nature and get on your bike and go for a cycle through the park and feeling so revived when you come back and ready to take on the world again, it will all be lost.
That the answer to the question of whether or not this mining is sustainable must be no, particularly it's not ecologically sustainable. Whether it will have a negative impact on future generations, the answer to that must be yes. In other words, it's not in the interests of future generations. And if one looks at the situation now, it will certainly have significant negative short-term implications, particularly through air pollution, etc., and the disruption of tourism and agriculture in the area. So the only real benefits seem to be to the shareholders of the particular companies that may be granted licenses to mine in these areas, and those will be short-lived benefits.